Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Everything Icelandic, an online program of the Icelandic National League of North America. The INLNA, which has been around since 1919, is proud to host this online series to encourage an awareness of everything Icelandic in the general public, and also to be of service to our member clubs. INLNA is an association of clubs and individuals across North America, and it is our mission to keep Icelandic culture alive and to increase awareness of Icelandic things. So welcome. We're pleased you're able to join us for this evening's webcast. And we're delighted to have with us today Christina Chowaniec, the author of the book Wind, Gravel, and Ice, a memoir of her grandfather as a Canadian soldier during the Second World War. Christina was introduced to us by Joanne DeCosimo, who sent a message in the fall of 2021 telling us that Christina had a book about to come out, and Joanne was really quite excited about it. And I have to say that I was quite excited about it too. A lot of people hear the stories of the British occupation of Iceland at a strategic point in the Second World War, and they're often not aware that there were an awful lot of Canadian soldiers who were part of that occupation. A few Canadian soldiers of Icelandic heritage, but mostly soldiers from other communities. And so this is an exciting book. I think an important contribution to the history of the Second World War, both in Canada and in Iceland. And I could launch into a long, windy description of the book, but that wouldn't be fair. It would probably be best just to turn the time over in a moment to Christina to offer her presentation about the book and how it came to be. In the meantime, I would tell you that if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. We won't get to them until Christina has done her presentation, but as questions come to you, feel free to post them in the chat. And otherwise, we will open up the microphones at the end to allow you to ask your questions directly. And so with that, I'm happy to give you Christina Chowaniec.
Thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you so much for the invitation to be with you all this evening. And I feel so great to be speaking to this community as well, because yeah, as Stefan mentioned, Joanne DeCosimo and Alan Johnson were the ones who originally had connected me, and subsequently to the their network in Iceland as well. So I feel like this project would not have come or been complete without these connections and these relationships. So it feels really fun to be with you all here this evening. I'm going to share my screen. So yeah, so tonight what I'd like to do this evening, so this is the cover of the book. What I'd like to do this evening is share with you some really amazing archival and personal photographs from officers' photo albums. And as I kind of go through, what that will do is kind of give you a little bit of a sense of what it would have been like to have been a Canadian soldier on the ground, in 1940. The photos are really candid and lovely, and you really get a sense of kind of what it would have been like. And then to kind of tie back to the book, so the book has the stories in it. The book is a memoir style. It's written in first person in my grandfather's voice. And it's the culmination. I didn't set out to write this book. It's a culmination of this 10+ year journey that I went on to when I discovered the story, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute. But yeah, this is kind of the end of it. And so this is what it was, his impressions and his stories and the people that he met and how it was for him. And the slideshow I'm going to show you tonight is a little more practical in some way. It's really showing you kind of like from the soldier's perspective in a visual way what it would have been like. So the story starts here with my grandfather. He was born in Smith Falls, Ontario, and he served in the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa. He enlisted in July and September of 1939, and he served the whole war in that regiment. And he met my Oma, my grandmother, in Holland, and they were married, and they came back to Canada. And he spent the rest of his adult life sort of in the Brockville, Smith Falls, Brockville area. We were very close. We had a cottage, and we had a great relationship. But he never really talked about the war. And he died when I was 11. And many years later, I was given a journal. And this journal was something that my mom had given him in the 80s. He was a lovely writer and storyteller. And so it was an opportunity for him just to write down some of his memories. And so this journal is just snapshots of his life from his time in, as a kid growing up, his time as a young man, the early days of the war in Ottawa, and then some of his in theaters experience. And at some point in his journal, he writes this word Kaldadarnes. And I apologize for my terrible anglicized version of Icelandic, so please forgive me. So Kaldadarnes it's near Selfoss, and that's where he was stationed. And I had no idea that he had been in Iceland. I had no idea that Canadian soldiers had been in Iceland. And so I went, all excited, away to research more and learn more about these Canadians in Iceland, and really subsequently discovered that very little had been written. Back in that, this is sort of like more than 10 years ago, like there was barely a Wikipedia entry, just to give you some idea of the thinness of the road that I was following. And so, yeah, that kind of set me on this path. And, I sort of went back to the beginning, to the archives in Ottawa, looking at war diaries and archival documents, and photos, and things kind of appeared. The story is it's very much a story that wanted to be told. I kind of feel like there's some kind of like bigger forces at work here, because this is not my day job. I'm not an academic historian. I came to this, the story found me, and I went off in search of it, piecing it together. And so there were just so many opportunities where the story could have gone on the back burner and just disappeared, and it wouldn't let me. Something would happen. I'd get an email, or somebody would send me a photo or something, and this pull, and it would keep going. And again, as that story that I kind of opened with Iceland is the same. When I said that I found a residency in Iceland near Laugarvatn, so that was very close to Selfoss, to kind of in that part of the world where my grandfather was stationed. And the Icelandic Canadian community was so instrumental in connecting me to the Icelandic community, where I could really spend some time talking to all the right people. And also just that experience in Iceland is so foundational, because Iceland is it's a character in the story, it's a character in the history. And so being there and experiencing the weather and the land and the sight lines, and I was able to, so Kaldadarnes was a farm. It still is a farm. That's why it was chosen as an air-based site. And the grandson of the man who owned the farm is still there. So I was able to walk out on the land. I met him and his family. I was able to go there and walk out on the airfield. And so just these incredible, connections to place. And it's so much of the story is about that, is about Iceland itself. Yeah, and I think I just want to add too that what I'm about to show you is very much the beginning of the story. Canadians were stationed there for about a year, and then the British were there, and then the Americans followed. And as you know, there was Americans stationed in Iceland, until the mid 2000s. So I mean, this is really the beginning of the story, where there was nothing, and so they were sort of building everything from scratch. So things really did change as time went on. And this is really much from the soldiers' perspective, right? Not the locals' perspective. This is sort of like what it would have been like from the sort of Canadian point of view. So yeah, just a really, really quick background. As you know, Iceland sort of sits halfway between Britain and North America. In this time, Britain was very heavily reliant on shipping from North America to sustain its war effort. And so the Atlantic was a super highway, right, of shipping, and so Iceland was really like this incredible place to protect and defend and refuel convoys. It was really an important physical piece of geography. And in 1940, June of 1940, Germany controlled France, Norway, the Low Countries, Denmark. And so the naval blockade that until that point had been pretty effectively controlled the Atlantic shipping lanes was no longer tenable. It was much more difficult to enforce, because Germany had direct access to the Atlantic shipping lanes from France and Norway. And so this really scared. And the other thing, I guess, from the Icelandic perspective is that, so it was a sovereign state, but it shared its defense and foreign affairs interests with Denmark. And so when Denmark fell in April of 1940, Iceland declared itself independent, but it was defenseless. It had no army or air force or navy. And so Britain was really, really worried, was really determined to keep it from falling into German hands. And so, when diplomatic methods of persuasion failed to persuade, Iceland to side on the side of the Allies, then Britain sent an invasion force, a battalion of Marines in May 1940 to secure the island. And so that's kind of the beginning of the troop movement. So the Britain is there in 1940, and the Canadians arrive in the summer. So the Royal Regiment of Canada arrives in June, and the Fusiliers Montreal and the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa arrive in July. And so in like the summer of 1940, there would have been about 2,500 Canadians stationed in Iceland. And this, I just love this. So they were there supporting mostly the British. So most of the troops, there were probably about 10,000, 12,000 British troops there at the time as well. And they were mostly from the 49th Division, which was had served in Norway, just evacuated from Norway. And when they were in Iceland, they had their regimental patch redesigned to be a polar bear, which I just think is so funny because, there are no polar bears in Iceland, and there were in 1940, there still aren't today. But it's a really cool patch, and it's kind of neat because it's made what they call in theater. And so all the patches are slightly different. Like sometimes the polar bear's facing a different direction, and they're all hand sewn. And I've never been able to find one. So I always thought this would be a great, really piece of, if you ever see one, I would be very excited. And then just from the Icelandic perspective, so these photos the next few photos are actually from a Canadian Geographic edition from October of 1940. So even though today the story is a little bit lost to history, 4 months after the Canadians were in Iceland, Canadian Geographic published a whole issue about Iceland, and there are War Office photos in there of some of the Canadians. And so it's just amazing that was sort of public knowledge in 1940. We've sort of forgotten a little bit. And so for Iceland's part, a small country, 120,000 people in 1940, pretty rural, very dependent on, agriculture and fishing. And from a soldier's perspective, because of the small population, there wasn't a lot of physical infrastructure. So there weren't barracks and warehouses and the things that soldiers needed to live in and to work out it. So, and because there weren't a lot of trees and natural resources, building materials, everything that the soldiers needed had to come from somewhere else. And then these photos too, this is again from that Canadian Geographic. So that's the cod, fish oil barrels stacked in the port there, and sort of more pastoral scenes of Iceland at the time. And then so the other part that was really difficult were the roads. So, there's very few of them. They were, most of them weren't paved. And they certainly weren't used to handling the kind of, heavy equipment and trucks that come with an army. And then when you layer weather on that, it was very difficult to get around the country. There were no airports, there were no railways. And as I say, there's not much in the way of natural resources. And just to put things in perspective, like RAF Kaldadarnes is about 45 miles from Reykjavik. And it took between 4.5 and 6 hours to drive there in 1940. And today, it took me 40 minutes. So like, it was pretty dramatic. And then in contrast, Reykjavik is a modern and connected European city, right? Universities and movie theaters and shops and cafes. So kind of like depending on where you were stationed, your experience would have been very different. And and also just that whole idea that Iceland was a very so literate. It's such a literate country. Everybody's really well educated. So just a kind of unique perspective maybe that was a bit different than Canada. Their arrival. So this story was told to me by an Icelandic historian who was a boy at the time, and the Fusiliers, Fusiliers Montreal and the Cameron Highlanders arrived together. And the Cameron Highlanders were a Highland regiment, so they had a full pipe and drum band. This photo on the right is just to give you an idea of what their full regalia looks like. This photo is from a parade in Ottawa. This photo on the left is from Reykjavik when they're marching from the harbor. But just to kind of give you a sense of what they would have looked like when the pipe and drum band put on their full regalia. And the prime minister had asked the locals to treat their new guests to treat their arrivals with the politeness due to guests. But they were uninvited guests, and this was an invasion, and there was a lot of fear and misapprehension about what this was going to mean, to have your home invaded, and especially huge troop numbers, right, that kind of dwarf the population, especially heavy male numbers. And so when they got off the boat and they walked from the harbor to the staging area, it was very quiet, like there no cheering and waving, right? And when they did, the pipe and drum band led the parade from the harbor to the staging area. And I don't think, bagpipes are a unique sound, already. And if you've, as an Icelander, you might not be familiar with bagpipes at that time. And so you get off the boat and you have these guys in these like kind of, outfits, and they have the bagpipes and they're walking. And so I think there's this kind of moment where they kind of cease to become, invading army and sort of become a spectacle. And I think there's this sort of brief moment, and you can see it here, like they're not cheering and waving on the streets, but the kids are sort of standing and they're pulling on their parents' hands to kind of be led closer to it. So there's this sort of feeling of like, I don't know, dropping your guard maybe and forming a new impression, or maybe these invaders aren't quite who you thought they were going to be, that kind of thing. And then consequently, the Canadians go to their staging area just outside the harbor, and it's, a few weeks, it's the first week of July, a few weeks after summer solstice, so there's not a lot of light. And so there's this lovely story in the war diary where the bugler goes out at 2200 hours and he blows lights out, and of course the sun doesn't set. And so when you're in a tent, there's a lot of light. And so he goes out again at 2230 to blow again, and it does, and again at 11. So now he's sort of making a joke out of it. And so there's like this really funny kind of thing about sort of the laughter at this stunt a little bit, and that kind of just that contrast between, Icelanders experiencing Canadians for the first time, and Canadians experience Iceland for the first time, kind of where the norms of home no longer apply. And these are all, young men. They've never been very far from home. I mean, I think my grandfather had been like an hour from his house, before he got on a boat and went to Iceland. Like, they, and they had no idea where they headed, and their departure was very sudden. They only had a few weeks, and they didn't return home, to say goodbye. And I think they probably expected they were going to England or Scotland. I don't think that they knew that the boat was gonna dock in Iceland. So there's a lot of, on their side too, right? There's a lot of excitement and surprise, and probably a little bit of misapprehension about where they had ended up. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but this is the port of Reykjavik in 1940. It's a small place, and it wasn't designed to take the material loads of an invasion force. It was intended to be a fishing harbor. And so now you becomes a bottleneck in the process. And like, for example, the big liner, they arrived on this big Empress of Australia ocean liner. It couldn't tie up to the dock. They had to anchor out, and they had to come in barges. And so, this became a bottleneck for a lot of the material loads that needed to come out of the country. And a lot of what's going to happen next is kind of as a result of that sort of situation, that kind of being a bottleneck problem. So from the soldiers' perspective, so they lived in canvas for 4 months, sort of until like the end of September, beginning of October. And it was the summer, but Icelandic weather is temperamental at best, even in the summer. So that it would have been pretty dramatic, living in a tent. And the tents and the trucks and the camo nets and the uniforms and everything they had were standard army issue khaki. And when you put standard army issue khaki against the Icelandic landscape, it kind of looks like this. It looks like snow on on lava dust. And so they kind of stood out like these little white flowers. And so they didn't have paint and all this stuff. And so somebody came up with some ingenious mixture of mixing lava dust with some kind of binding agent so that they could paint the tents. And you can see in the bottom right a little bit there, they started to paint them, what a difference it makes when they were using the colors of the landscape to hide themselves against the landscape. It's pretty dramatic. And then just in those early days, the Canadians didn't have enough machine guns with them. They didn't bring enough trucks with them. They didn't have concrete and sandbags instead of the basic amenities that you need when you're building a base. And this photo here is so that gate on the road would have been made by the locals. And I just sort of love that idea of the local knowledge, right? Using what you had around you to make the things, and sort of the Canadians sort of slowly figuring this out over time. You can see in this photo, for example, here, they started to bank their tents in sod and things like that to protect it from the wind, and stacking rocks. And so just sort of, learning from the locals a little bit. They're spread very thin, across the island down to the company level, and in my grandfather's case, down to the platoon level. So there's a lot of isolation, and and as I said, there wasn't a lot in terms of military equipment, tanks and mechanized troop transit, and there was no airfield yet and no planes. So this is like, pretty early days. And then just sort of I just like this photo because it's so human, it's so candid. But just they lived in canvas, and the war diaries just talk endlessly of the weather. So when you put Canadians like talking about weather anyway, and then when you put Canadians in Iceland, it's a whole other level. So there's just the constant and endless change, and part of it was because part of their misery was that they had all the wrong clothing. Their clothing was all wool. There were no proper rain or wind protection. They had these gas capes, but the gas capes were like they're like leather ponchos soaked in oil. So they're like heavy. They're not good for working in or moving around in. And then they were told that those were for gas attacks and they weren't allowed to use them as rain protection. So and just they had a lot of, as I said, trouble with supplies. So the wear and tear on their equipment and boots and things weren't replaced quickly enough. And in mid-August, they get these jerkins, this photo on the left here. So that leather vest. And that was a really, really, really practical item, wind blocking and warm and rain blocking. But yeah, those early days were really tough. There's a lot of issues with morale. They didn't have stoves or really good facilities for drying clothing. So they lived in just these wet wearing conditions. This is a photo of one of the local kitchens. I don't know if you can quite see, but I think it says Hell's Kitchen on that sign that's sort of tacked up on the side. But I just, with the Icelandic landscape ever present, right? That glacial moraine behind it. And, the local food would have been sort of fish and mutton. That was what would have been available. And everything else had to come from North America, which is a long way. So there wasn't a lot of fresh food. And with all the disruption in the supply chains in those early days, especially in the isolated areas, a lot of the guys were eating like, composite rations from like the First World War. And then in town there were more recreational activities. I think, as I mentioned, your experience would have really been determined a lot about where you were stationed. Where my grandfather was in Kaldadarnes, they were just far away, and it was hard to get around. So the YMCA, the Canadian YMCA, was responsible for looking after the canteens and recreational facilities for the Canadian soldiers during the whole war, like not just in Iceland, but in most of the theaters of war where they were, in the same way that the NAFI would have done for the British. And so they would have had passes into town and been able to go and do things. One of the main kind of interesting things was one of the agreements between the British, military headquarters and the Icelandic government was because that there were no fraternizing with locals, because they were really worried about this immense troop numbers. And so they would have run into locals in their day-to-day and in businesses, but there were no organized social events, for example, dances and things like that. And then out in Kaldadarnes, there was less to do. I know they played a lot of baseball, and I think they spent a lot of time. There's a lot of legwork in those early days too, exploring and doing recce's and learning about their new environment, and lots of building the basic necessities, their camps, and then massive construction projects like airfields and roads and gun emplacements. It's endless. And so there wasn't a lot of time for training and for in those early days. And the sort of great irony as well is that working in bad weather with bad clothing and all the problems that came with that was sort of still preferable to being confined to your tent with nothing to do. So this is one of the first mail calls. So a lot of the war diaries talk so much about how there were many enemies in Iceland and none of them were German. And so it was, boredom and the weather and the isolation. And so this is the first mail call. This was July 27th. So that's like more than 3 weeks after they arrived, did they get their first mail. So that's very wearing when you're, dealing with these, they're not the best conditions, and, you're isolated, not just from home, but from potentially your other units. And there just weren't there's creature comforts, and kind of a lot of hard labor. And I just couldn't resist putting in a few photos of sort of the weather effects. So this is the air base after a big rainstorm. And this was one of the tent camps. I mean, it's just kindling. There's really nothing left after a gale hit it in September. And then in sort of towards the end of September, they start to get Nissan huts. So these are the British style, like prefab huts. They come in pieces and you snap them together. All you have to do is kind of pour the concrete floor. The Canadians had something similar. They were called Yukon huts, Yukon style. So it's so the same idea. It's a different like layout and building materials, but like the kind of principle is the same, that it's sort of like these kit huts. But because of the supply issues and, a lot of things at the docks, it was decided that the British would provide the hutting situation for the Canadians. So yeah, this is what they look like. It was a nice little round domes. And then that really changed, they had stoves. They were cozy, for all ranks. It would have been like about 16 men per hut. So certainly, cozy, but, it was warm. They had stoves in them. They were able to dry things and, heat up water. And yeah, life started to get a little bit better. The photo here, you can see in the middle of this. So they started to get their good winter clothing started to arrive from Canada. The officers had fur hats from Montreal. And that this first photo here again was from the beginning of the slideshow, but this just shows like the sheepskin parkas that finally arrived for the soldiers. So things start to get sorted out, and life starts to get a little bit better. And for what Iceland lacked in sort of the barracks and sort of the infrastructure, it's certainly made up for in its natural beauty. And there were many opportunities for them to get out and to explore and to see the incredible natural geography of Iceland. And so here are some of the officers at the geyser, and the waterfalls, and the national park with the tectonic rift in it. So really just being able to see all those things. And of course the hot springs. So as every small town in Iceland has hot spring and has a place, a pool, and so they would have gone to these places in and around, and had their bath parades there. And I think that would have been a highlight too. I know that for them, that for many Canadians, that would have been a new experience for them. Yeah, and so just I mentioned already, the small pre-war population and sort of the lack of the rules against fraternizing and not having social events and dances and things. Certainly in the smaller communities, I think it would have, soldiers would have come into contact with locals. There were hundreds and hundreds of locals working on construction projects around the country. There would have been hundreds of them working on the base, for example, where my grandfather was stationed. And the officers really made a big effort to connect with local business leaders and mayors and create relationships, because I think so much of it is not just language and culture, but it's like this green wall, right? Like it's this faceless army, and there's roadblocks cropping up on your roads, and places are now restricted, and it's sort of you don't know who these people are. And so I think a big part of it was sort of being able to have these these kind of one-on-ones and show the people behind the mask, as it were. And I think with Canada, they were really, like they had those connections to Iceland that the British didn't have, right? Because, like where you are today, right? I mean, there was so many Icelanders that settled in Canada, and, in the late 1800s, and many of them served in sort of the Viking and the Scandinavian regiments through the First World War. So, those relationships went a really long way to helping, on the day-to-day. And I know as well that the French Canadian Regiment, especially, they were called the Good Devils, and they were really good at asking for forgiveness and not permission. They were really good at fraternizing and doing all the things, to make to integrate and feel a little bit more comfortable, right? To kind of have those relationships. And I know that on the airbase, for example, too, it was a farm. And the farm where the airbase was, the farmer had to leave, in July when the troop built up and they started building the airbase in Rio, but there were farms all around it as well. And there's stories where, the farmers sold milk and eggs and rented out their horses so the soldiers could ride them. And so, they were interacting with the local community. And certainly that's what I found, when I was there, that everybody was so open and helpful and interested in helping, and just, liked that I was trying to piece the story together. They were so willing to be helping me. And this photo on the right, so this is from so this is the Canadian Battalion translator Lobson, and the Canadians rented a warehouse like in Reykjavik, and they put on like a Christmas party for the kids. And so he's dressed in a red dyed, long johns, and he has an infirmary grade cotton ball, beard. And they showed like cartoons, something that didn't need language, it didn't need to be translated, and gave out chocolate and oranges. So just one snapshot of, trying to connect with the locals. And here's the Sam Scott. He was the pipe master for the Cameron Highlanders, and he's on one of those Icelandic horses that they were renting around the base. And so by the end of September, early October 1940, the first squadron of ferry battles arrives from Scotland. So the airbase would have been sufficiently complete to at least allow planes to land at that point. And other sort of equipment starts to trickle in with like the artillery, the searchlights, and the coastal defense guns and the anti-aircraft guns and things like that. So the kind of, tactical situation starts to improve and a little bit more. So there wasn't just, trenches and sod. This is the Canadian Royal Regiment of Canada and their new Bren carriers. So yeah, and then I'll just end here, this last little slide here. So this is the photo from the cover of the book. This is a ferry battle landing. And just, so this photo is actually my grandfather's photo. And he should not have had this photo. Like, he should not have had a camera. He should not have been taking photos of military installations. And actually all of the photos that we see, even the officers' albums, they shouldn't exist, because I think Iceland was a little bit of an oversight. When they got to England, they had their cameras taken away. They weren't allowed to take photos anymore, and they certainly weren't allowed to have them in France and, in theater. And so this is really this kind of wonderful thing where this Icelandic story is kind of unknown, but it's really well documented with all of these images that I showed you. And this photo kind of really fell out of the sky. Like, I still don't really know where it came from, but it was on one of the photos on his camera roll. Just to sort of finish by talking a little bit about legacy, that, for me, it was always about relationships, that how a few hundred men 70 plus years ago, created the beginnings of relationships that I was able to experience, and also, through the Icelandic Canadian community as well. In February of 1941, so February 9th, 1941, a German plane strafed the Kaldadarnes airfield. So it came out of Norway, and it traded bombs for fuel, and it flew 1,000 miles specifically to strafe the airfield and parts of Selfoss and some military installations in and around Selfoss. And the idea, it was a show of force. And in that way, it worked. It really did scare Britain and also America that Iceland was not out of harm's way, right? Like, that it could be reached by air. And right after that happened, so a month after, so that was February 1941, in March 1941, America and Britain signed one of the most important agreements of the war, which was called the Lend-Lease Agreement. And so this really brought the Americans into the war in a meaningful way, 11 months before Pearl Harbor. It ended what was called the cash and carry. So up until that point, Britain had to pay for everything, all of its war munitions, everything from North American cash. And we would know by that point in the war, it was out of cash. And so this enabled the US to loan money and equipment. You often hear about the 50 ships, the 50 destroyers. That was sort of like a symbolic gesture, but that was part of this agreement. So part of really extending the international waters, the American defense waters out towards Greenland a little bit, so that their convoys could be protected farther. So there's a lot of things that came with this agreement that really brought America into the war. In a pretty meaningful way, even before the formal declaration. And then, as I mentioned earlier, they garrisoned Iceland when the Canadians left. So the Canadians, the Royal Regiment and the Fusiliers Monroy were only there for 4 months. They were there from July to October of 1940. And then they went to England to join the rest of the Canadians that were there. And my grandfather's regiment was a machine gun regiment. And so they were asked to stay a little bit longer to defend the sort of more the strategic locations that they needed. And so they were there until about May. So about, 10, 11 months they were in Iceland. And when they left, the Americans took over because Britain, at this point in the war, they're in North Africa, Crete and Greece, and they're having a lot of trouble on some, in other theaters of war. And they needed those troops to go to the front lines. And so America stepped in, and they sent troops to Iceland to garrison Iceland in July 1941. So, they were quite active in doing these things, as I say, before before Pearl Harbor. And I guess my grandfather was in the field that day. He was sitting in the airfield when it got strafed. And so that's sort of the culmination of, he was uninjured, but there was a couple of British guys that got hurt, and one British soldier was killed in that attack on a bridge in Selfoss. And so for me, that was just this sort of culmination of, him being there, right? Sort of being there at this moment that really did change the war in a pretty significant way. So yeah, I will stop talking and see if there's some questions, and if anything you want to ask or comments or Anything like that?
Thank you for that, Christina. It really it makes the experience personal. To hear the stories, still set within the larger context of the war history, but to have it relayed as a story that involves real people. You said that the book is written in memoir form. How challenging was it for you to find your grandfather's voice without losing
Yeah,
your
it's
own?
a great question, and I've been asked that before, and you know what? To this day, I'm not sure. I mean, I do feel like, as I say, that the story chose me, and that there was definitely like bigger forces at play that kind of brought it to life. So maybe there was channeling that a little bit. But I don't know. I think potentially maybe it's not always his voice. Maybe it's mine and my impressions and experiences as well that kind of added to it. So yeah, it's always a tough one. You try to be as true to the history as you can, and then it's written as a sort of a what do you call it, like historical fiction, right? I mean, it's or creative nonfiction. It's everything in the book is true. Didn't necessarily all happen to my grandfather. And then there's trying to bring as much of the history to bear as possible, and then trying to make it a story as well.
Sure. Do you feel like you understand him better?
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah, it was a really interesting journey to go on. And yeah, I wish that, he never went back to any of these places. And, how amazing would it have been to be able to travel with him and visit these places together?
Indeed. Are there others who have questions? If okay,
Yep. So they're
Natalie,
called the Nissan huts.
why don't you share them, Natalie?
I've moved locations and I'm up with my son. Can you hear me?
Forget. I know I can see them. It's fine. So the question
Okay.
was, what were the name of those dome buildings? So they're the Nissan huts. I just typed it there. I think it was named after probably the guy who designed them. My cousins in the east of Iceland called them Canadian buildings. Yeah. So one of the kind of really interesting things was that because of the sort of lack of infrastructure in Iceland. So the Canadians, the British built a bunch of these, and the Americans built thousands and thousands. And they were kind of like after the war, because when you go to Iceland and try to piece this together, there's not a lot of material things left, right? They were taken apart, and so it's same with the Nissan huts. They were kind of a hot ticket item, and so they were taken down, and they were in a lot of they went to people, right? They were in farms, and they got redistributed all over the country because they were so useful, and they could be transported. It's kind of interesting because you see them around when you drive around Iceland a little bit. Have I been to the War Museum? Yeah, so I went to the War and Peace Museum, and that was really amazing. So the fellow there was so helpful, and he has all these really it's a lot of artifacts, right? Like a lot of like that tactile things that sold. It's not a lot of like arms and things like that. It's so personal. It's like the shaving kit and the clothing and the uniforms, and some of the things that they had, like notebooks, and yeah, it was so cool. And he has one sort of set up, like, yeah, he has a really cool space, and it was really amazing to go there and to talk to him. And he has lots of photos. Yeah, and one of the photos that still sticks in mind, so he showed me this amazing photo. It's an aerial photo of so in Whale Harbor, which is this huge harbor, as you head up towards as you head sort of west from Reykjavik. And it was the British naval had a huge naval center there where they would refuel convoys, and there's a huge naval base there. And so there's this aerial photograph that he showed me of the British military infrastructure in this harbor. And I was like, oh, that's an amazing photo. And he's like, yeah, that was taken by the Germans. So it was a German reconnaissance plane that had taken that photo. And it's one of the best photos I've ever seen of that installation. So yeah, he was just so lovely to talk to. So if you ever go to Iceland, I would recommend dropping in and seeing that space.
Okay, I see that Dawn asks, did the Americans stay until the end of the war?
Yeah, just about. So they stayed until sort of the Normandy invasion sort of started. So sort of until 1944. So a lot of different things happened. So basically the main thing was closing the kind of radar and protection gap on the convoys. And so like 1940, 1941, 1942, 1943, like huge attrition rates. And sort of at the end of 1943, that attrition rate really starts to drop. They get B-24s, they fly B-24s from Iceland, from Newfoundland, from Greenland. So they are able to protect the convoys almost the whole way. And just the improvements in radar and being able to detect that and being able to protect and equipping the ships. There's this so that was really huge, was that closing that gap, really being able to protect the convoys. And so by 1944, that gap, like the attrition rate was much like, very reasonable. And also they were ready to move the troops from Iceland to Normandy and actually eventually to the Pacific. So yeah, the troop, I think height was probably about 40,000 Americans sort of at the peak, probably around 1943. And then sort of after that, it starts to drop, probably 1944, 1945, they're probably more like 10,000 troops. And then, at the end of the war, Iceland becomes a founding member of NATO and, became an important, linchpin in sort of in NATO and in the Cold War. And so Americans were stationed, in and around Keflavik, for a long time.
I have another question. Were you fortunate enough when you were there to be able to see the last vestiges of the runways?
Yeah, it was amazing being able to just having permission and going out on the land and then being able to go to this guy's house and chat with him about everything is really cool. But yeah, it's just enough. There's like edges of concrete, there's a little, there was the front of a Jeep, with, you could tell it was a Jeep, like the grate from a Jeep, but like the round Jeep hole, there's these little rusty bits kind of around. But it's really the flatness and that you really see why they, despite it was very close to the Elfusa River, like a big river. There's a huge estuary there, like not the ideal place really to be building an airfield. And in 1943, it flooded actually, and they lost 2 of the runways, and then they moved everybody from Kaldadarnes to Keflavik, where the Americans were building the big airstrips there. And so they used the runways, but troops weren't stationed at Kaldadarnes after like March 1943.
It's really quite remarkable that there's probably more of that airfield left than there is infrastructure left at Whalefield.
It's so true. Yeah, it's so true.
Military base was.
Yeah.
So I'm just watching to see if other people have questions. I have some cousins who grew up in Nissan huts.
Oh, wow.
It was one who, it's where poorer Icelanders lived in many cases, if they actually grew up in one. And several of my cousins who grew up in such circumstances went on to great fame and fortune as adults, but it was pretty humble housing.
Beginnings. Mm-hmm.
So tell us how people can get your book.
Oh yeah. I'll put the website here. It's just
Okay.
windgravelandice.com. Yeah, and so the book is available there. You can get it on Amazon, or I make more money if you buy it through like the Friesen bookstore or something like that. But there's all kind of links there. Apple Books, you can get ebook version of it and so on like that. And yeah.
Okay. The title is obviously descriptive. Were those your grandfather's words or yours?
No, it's funny. That title, they were mine in the end, and it's sort of my working title was like this long title, right? A very sort of academic title, like the history of the Canadian soldiers and whatever, and I was like, this is a story. That's not what the book should be called. So that's sort of where it came out. I was trying to, and it kind of matched. Just that photo that I found was so amazing, and I just thought it matched. The sort of the feeling of my experience in that place. So anyway.
So when do you next plan to go back to Iceland?
I don't know
Well-
yet. This is a journey, you know, there are no plans here. As I say, like, never sure from one moment to the next sort of how this is going to go. So it's so lovely to, you know, start my new year off speaking with you. And yeah, I would love to continue the journey and, you know, maybe have have it translated or, you know, or at least for sale in Iceland. And yeah, I'm not sure where it's going to lead next, but I would love to be able to go back and you know, see all the people that I met and yeah, just be able to travel. I told Stefan at the beginning that I was actually there in February, so it was a really interesting time to be there. So beautiful, you know, the Northern Lights, and it snowed, and so I'd love to go back in the summer and drive the Circle Road and, you know, really be able to see more of the country than I did in the winter.
It is a grand and beautiful land. So
There's no place like it. It's really incredible.
and it's a, well, I guess I'm curious, you know, your brief experience there, did it have influences on how you ended up writing the book in the end? Did it make a difference?
Yeah, I don't think I could have written a book without being there for so many reasons. I mean, there so much of the content, you know, came from the research that I did when I was there and the interviews that I conducted. But I think when you asked earlier about my voice, I think I found my voice there. And I think a lot of you know, the descriptions that are in the book are from my experiences of being on the land and experiencing, you know, the different parts of the country. And it was so foundational. Like, yeah, absolutely don't think the book would exist, or not in the way that it does, without having had that experience.
It's certainly an important story, and it personalizes the war. You know, so many histories of wartime are written from the perspective of politics and strategy and but the reality is that wars are fought by individual soldiers who find themselves far from home and are there just because, you know, it's not something they would necessarily
Exactly.
choose themselves.
Yeah, and one of the so I guess two quick things. One, just that it's not really a war story at all, right? It's set in war, but it's not about war. It's really about, it's a coming of age story. It's about this young man, as you say, who's far from home. He's experiencing new things for the first time, and you know, having his impressions, you know, pushed and changed. Yeah, and just as you say too, that, you know, you have no choice over where you go and how things unfold. And so when I mentioned, so the Canadians, the Royal Regiment of Canada and the Fusiliers Montreal, they left in October, and they went to join the 2nd Canadian Division in England. And it's the second Canadian Division that then was the spearhead for the Dieppe raid. And when my grandfather was transferred in, you know, in May of 1941, he joined the different division. He joined the 3rd Division. So just that part of it too kind of gives me chills, right? That the hand of God, right, about these random placements that you're given and the random timings and selection, and that he escaped Dieppe by just, you know, being asked to stay in Iceland for 6 months longer, that kind of thing. And I'm sure there's so many stories that are like that.
I worked with a man who was in the cleanup crew at Dieppe, and it affected him for his entire life. I'm curious to know what your grandfather did when he returned home.
He, I mean, he had a family. He worked for Frost and Woods, and which was an agricultural machinery. Like, he worked in like, you know, in a factory, and later for Phillips Cables in Rockville. So yeah, he was a salt of the earth kind of character. And I think my greatest, so he my mom and her brother and he bought like a cabin near Smith Falls, like a recreational cabin, and so that's where we kind of grew up as a family. And I think that's where a lot of like my greatest memories and joy come from, those experiences, being there with him and the rest of my family. So I feel like, if, you know, that's one legacy piece that he left for me.
Wonderful. And what do you do when you're not writing memoirs from
Oh
the
yeah,
war?
I work for a nature charity. I'm based in Vancouver. It's called Nature Kids BC, and we work with we get families both, like, it's not a drop-off club, so families and parents go together, and they go out on little field trips and learn about nature, and yeah, get connected with their big backyards.
Excellent. Well, if I'm just looking to see if anyone else has a question, this is your opportunity to get in,
Mhm.
or we'll wrap it up.
I'll put my my email address here in the chat. If you know, everything comes to mind after the fact, or anybody wants to get in touch with me, please do. My contact information is on the Wind, Gravel, and Ice website as well. So thank you so much for your invitation, for your interest, and yeah, just for having me here this evening.
Thank you, Christina, and I know I look forward to reading the book, and I'm confident that those here this evening look forward to it as well. So thank you for your time and your well, I guess I was going to say your grandfather's fascinating story, but it's a story you now share. So
Exactly.
thank you for your magnificent saga and for spending this evening with us. And I'd like to thank those who joined us this evening for this webinar, and encourage you to check out the Icelandic National League of North America website. That's inlofna.org to find out more about what the Icelandic National League does. And until next time, it's been wonderful to be here learning together. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.